Picture this. You're standing in the torchlit halls of Topkapi Palace, the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. The year is 1645. Outside these walls, Janissary soldiers prepare for war, merchants unload silks and spices, and imams call the faithful to prayer. But inside, in the Sultan's private chambers, a very different ritual is unfolding. The doors creak open, and you are ushered into a room so vast it feels more like a theater than a bedroom. Gold draperies fall from the ceiling. The floor glistens with Persian carpets, already stained with spilled wine and oil. Along the walls, concubines stand trembling, their eyes downcast, waiting to be chosen or condemned. And then he enters. Sultan Ibrahim I, known to his subjects as Ibrahim the Mad. He is barely 30, draped in robes heavy with jewels, but his eyes dart like a trapped animal. He does not walk with the dignity of a ruler, but with the restless hunger of a man consumed by impulses he cannot control. With a wave of his hand, the ritual begins. Servants drag forward barrels of olive oil. Concubines are ordered to strip, their bodies gleaming under the torchlight as oil is poured over their skin. But this is not for seduction. The Sultan claps his hands, demanding they crawl on all fours. He shouts commands like a ringmaster at a circus. One is dressed with horsehair tails, another fitted with antlers, another smeared with feathers. They are no longer women. They are animals, living toys in a grotesque masquerade for the Sultan's amusement. The room echoes with nervous laughter, forced through fear. A concubine slips, her body slick with oil, and the Sultan erupts in manic giggles, clapping his hands like a child delighted with a puppet show. But his delight quickly turns to rage. He points at her trembling form, and with a single order, guards rush forward. A sack is brought in, thick canvas, heavy rope. The woman is stuffed inside as she screams and struggles. Servants stitch the bag shut while she thrashes inside. And then, without ceremony, they drag her away toward the Bosphorus. Everyone in the room knows what that means. She will be drowned before the night is over. The Sultan is not horrified by this. He is electrified. He turns back to the room, grinning, demanding more women crawl, more laughter, more spectacle. To him, cruelty is not the byproduct of pleasure. It is the pleasure. The chroniclers of the court tried to erase these scenes, to portray Ibrahim as merely eccentric, afflicted by melancholy, perhaps unfit for office. But the truth, whispered in corridors and preserved in foreign letters, was far darker. His chamber was not a place of love, but of domination. Not of romance, but of ritualized humiliation. Imagine being one of those women, your life dictated by the flick of a hand, your future balanced between being paraded like livestock or drowned in the river like an unwanted pet. Each moment in the Sultan's presence was a gamble between survival and spectacle. And as shocking as this night seems, it was not an exception. It was the pattern. The Sultan's nights blurred into endless pageants of excess, cruelty, and madness, scenes so depraved they would scar the empire itself. This is not legend, this is not exaggeration, this is not fiction. This is the true story of Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, the most perverted sultan in history. The madness of Sultan Ibrahim did not appear overnight. To understand the man who turned his palace into a theater of humiliation, we must first return to his childhood. Because Ibrahim the Mad was not born in fire and cruelty, he was forged in silence. The silence of the Kafes. The word means cage, but it was no ordinary prison. Inside Topkapi Palace stood a gilded compound of locked rooms and narrow courtyards where Ottoman princes were confined. For centuries, this system was meant to prevent rival claimants to the throne from plunging the empire into civil war. A prince inside the cage could not rebel. He could not build allies. He could not gather an army. He could only wait. Ibrahim entered the Kafes as a boy. He was not allowed to walk freely. He was not allowed to see the city that stretched beyond the palace walls. His companions were silent eunuchs who obeyed, but never spoke. His days passed in endless repetition. Waking, eating, praying, staring at the walls. Weeks blurred into months, months into years. Some princes endured this confinement and emerged cautious, calculating, and politically shrewd. Others broke. Ibrahim broke. Isolation twisted him. Without human contact, his mind spun in circles, creating fantasies, obsessions, and fears. He became terrified of shadows, convinced that assassins lurked in corners. At other times, he fell into hysterical laughter, whispering to himself, inventing games of power and control with invisible playthings. Where other boys learned hunting, music, and diplomacy, Ibrahim learned only fear. The cage was not empty of temptations. Occasionally, concubines were sent into the chambers to entertain the princes. It was meant as a kindness, a relief. But for Ibrahim, it planted something darker. With no guidance, no affection, no sense of normal relationships, intimacy became tangled with paranoia and domination. His desires grew strange, compulsive, unmoored from love or tenderness. It was not about connection, it was about control. Meanwhile, his older brother Murad IV ruled the empire with an iron hand. Murad was a warrior, a drinker, a tyrant in his own right. He was famous for prowling the streets of Istanbul at night in disguise, strangling drunkards with his own hands. Ibrahim heard these stories through muffled voices at the edge of his confinement. To him, power became synonymous with cruelty. To rule was to kill. To survive was to dominate. For 2 decades, Ibrahim remained in this gilded prison. By the time he was a man, he had known nothing else. His skin grew pale from lack of sun. His body softened from idleness. His mind swam with fears and fantasies. When he dreamed of freedom, it was not of justice or wisdom. It was of indulgence, endless food, endless women, endless revenge against the silence that had caged him. And then, in 1640, the silence broke. Murad IV, the mighty warrior sultan, was dead at just 27. He left no sons, no heirs. The empire that stretched from Hungary to Iraq now looked to Ibrahim, the forgotten brother in the cage. At first, Ibrahim refused to believe it. He trembled when the viziers came with news of Murad's death. He suspected a trap, a cruel trick to draw him out and execute him. He had to be coaxed from the Kafes, dragged almost, weeping and begging for his life. His paranoia was so deep that he clung to the doorframe, refusing to step into freedom. But there was no trap. The throne was his. Imagine the moment. After 20 years in isolation, Ibrahim stepped into the open air, the world exploding around him. Sunlight burning his pale eyes, courtiers bowing, servants rushing forward, the roar of cannons announcing his coronation. Overnight, he went from prisoner to absolute ruler of one of the greatest empires on earth. Power crashed over him like a flood. He had not been trained in governance, diplomacy, or war. He had not studied law or strategy. He knew only hunger and fear. And now every hunger could be fed, every fear could be silenced by ordering a death. Every fantasy could be made flesh. Historians describe Ibrahim's early reign as a strange blend of indecision and excess. He leaned heavily on his mother, Perverted Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. For a time, she held the reins of government while her son stumbled through the bewildering world of leadership. But even she could not contain the storm brewing within him. Because for Ibrahim, the throne was not liberation. It was indulgence. The years of confinement had left him ravenous. Where another ruler might have sought stability, he sought escape. Escape from loneliness, escape from paranoia, escape from the scars of silence by drowning them in bodies, in rituals, in spectacles. No one could refuse him. This is the tragedy of Ibrahim the Mad, a boy raised in isolation, denied education, denied human warmth, handed absolute power without ever learning how to use it. He emerged from the cage not as a leader, but as a man bent on consuming everything denied to him. Food, wealth, women, cruelty, it was all the same. It was all appetite. And it was an appetite that would soon devour the empire itself. Before we go deeper into how trauma shaped one of history's darkest rulers, hit that subscribe button to The History Scar. Don't just watch this and vanish. These forgotten truths cost lives, and if you won't subscribe, at least explain why in the comments. The moment Sultan Ibrahim stepped from the cage into freedom, the Ottoman harem, already one of the largest and most secretive institutions in the world, became his personal theater of madness. For centuries, the harem had been more than a place of pleasure. It was a political engine, a fortress of women who shaped dynasties, birthed heirs, and maneuvered in the shadows of the empire. But under Ibrahim, it lost all pretense of dignity. It became an endless stage where his compulsions and perversions were performed night after night. The numbers alone staggered observers. Previous sultans maintained harems of a few dozen concubines, sometimes 100 in times of expansion. Ibrahim demanded hundreds more. Courtiers were dispatched across the empire and beyond, instructed to find women of every age, every body type, every background. Christian captives from the Balkans, Armenian girls from Anatolia, Jewish maidens from Istanbul's ghettos, Circassians from the Caucasus, all were funneled into the palace to satisfy his hunger. But it was not beauty alone he craved. His appetites were strange, distorted by years of isolation. Ibrahim ordered that women of extraordinary size be brought to him, rewarding merchants who could find the heaviest, most corpulent women in the empire. Chroniclers record him delighting in watching them eat banquets of sweets while he stroked their skin, declaring that the empire must be fat with plenty like these women. To his mind, their bodies symbolized abundance, even as famine stalked his subjects beyond the palace walls. Other fetishes were darker still. He demanded costumes, animal skins, bird feathers, silken bindings. He commanded women to crawl on all fours like beasts, their bodies oiled to gleam under torchlight. In his chamber, women became horses, cows, sheep, even fish. Sometimes he would dress himself as well, wearing furs and leaping among them, roaring with laughter as if he were both master and beast. The harem was no longer a place of intimacy. It was a grotesque masquerade, a carnival of humiliation where women's humanity dissolved into props for his fantasies. Every evening became a performance. Concubines rehearsed routines to please him. Musicians played frantic rhythms while women paraded in absurd disguises, their eyes empty, their movements mechanical. Ibrahim sat on cushions, demanding adjustments like a director fine-tuning a scene. More feathers, more oil. Bind their hands tighter. Make them crawl slower. Make them scream louder. This was his symphony of madness, echoing through marble halls while the empire outside groaned under taxes and war. But the greatest horror came not from the performances, but from his paranoia. Ibrahim trusted no one, not even his own harem. Whispers terrified him. A stray word could be twisted into betrayal, and in his mind, betrayal demanded annihilation. The most infamous episode occurred in 1647. A rumor reached his ears that one of his concubines had taken a lover. There was no proof, no investigation, only a whisper carried by jealous rivals. But to Ibrahim, suspicion was enough. Rage seized him, and he declared that the entire harem was corrupted, every woman tainted by treachery. What followed shocked even hardened palace servants. That night, guards stormed the harem. Concubines were seized by the hair, dragged screaming through corridors, their silken garments tearing as they clawed at the floor. One by one, they were bound and stuffed into heavy sacks, hundreds of them. The air filled with shrieks, prayers, desperate pleas for mercy. Mothers clutched daughters, sisters held hands until the ropes cut them apart. Under torchlight, the sacks were carried out of the palace and down to the Bosphorus shore. Ottoman chroniclers, usually cautious with their words, recorded the horror in rare bluntness. 280 women, the flower of the harem, were thrown into the dark waters. Their bodies writhed inside the sacks as they sank, muffled screams bubbling into silence. The Bosphorus, that eternal river between continents, became a grave for hundreds in a single night. Only a handful were spared, favorites chosen at the last moment, or women too ill to be moved. By dawn, the harem was a tomb. The survivors walked through corridors eerily quiet, rooms empty, mirrors reflecting absence. Servants whispered of ghosts lingering by the water, of cries echoing in the night long after the women had drowned. To Ibrahim, this massacre was not tragedy, it was purification. He declared the harem cleansed, fit once again to house his fantasies. New concubines were purchased, new costumes sewn, new spectacles staged. The cycle resumed as though nothing had happened. Foreign ambassadors carried these tales to Europe, where they spread like wildfire. To Christian courts already hostile to the Ottomans, Ibrahim was proof that the empire was rotting from within. Pamphlets described him as a beast, a pervert, a man unfit for rule. Even within the Ottoman court, whispers grew louder. Viziers and soldiers muttered that the Sultan's chamber had become more dangerous than any battlefield. The transformation of the harem was not just a private madness, it was the corrosion of an institution that had once been the empire's hidden strength. Where other sultans' harems had produced heirs, fostered alliances and stabilized the dynasty, Ibrahim's harem produced only terror, humiliation, and corpses. And yet, in his own twisted logic, Ibrahim believed himself enlightened. He called his rituals art, his costumes philosophy, his cruelty wisdom. Like Pepi of Egypt, with his symphonies of suffering, Ibrahim saw himself as a conductor of human experience, orchestrating fear and desire as if they were instruments to be played for his amusement. But behind the laughter, behind the spectacles, the empire was bleeding. Taxes soared to fund his endless appetites. Families were torn apart to supply his harem. Soldiers grew restless as resources drained away from war to pleasure. And still the Sultan demanded more. The harem had become his theater of madness. Soon, the empire itself would become his stage. The drowning of 280 women in the Bosphorus should have been enough to chill Ibrahim's desires. For most rulers, such a night of blood and terror would mark a turning point, a moment of remorse, or at least restraint. But for Ibrahim, it was only the beginning. The massacre had cleared space. Space in the harem. Space in his imagination. Space for rituals that would soon eclipse even the darkest whispers of Ottoman history. Ibrahim's chambers became laboratories of indulgence where concubines were no longer wives, lovers, or even companions. They became experiments, living canvases upon which the Sultan painted his obsessions. One ritual was devoted entirely to food. Ibrahim would order tables piled with sweets, roasted meats, mountains of rice dripping with butter, pastries soaked in honey. He selected certain women, always those with the largest bodies, and commanded them to eat. Not modestly, not delicately, but ravenously, until they could barely breathe. Servants stood ready with more platters, more trays, more pitchers of sweetened sherbet, pouring and feeding until the women trembled under the weight of their own gluttony. The Sultan watched with fascination. He would stroke his beard and clap in delight as women's stomachs swelled, their breaths coming in gasps. To him, their suffering was a symbol of plenty, proof that the empire was abundant because he could command it so. When the women collapsed in exhaustion, he would declare them beautiful beyond measure, sometimes rewarding them with jewels, other times casting them aside like broken instruments. Another ritual was stranger still. Ibrahim developed an obsession with fur. He had garments sewn from sable, mink, fox, and even the skins of wild animals brought from distant provinces. Concubines were forced to wear these furs against bare skin, their bodies sweating beneath the heavy pelts. Then he made them crawl before him, growling like beasts, while he threw them scraps of meat as if they were hounds at a hunt. Chroniclers record one particular fantasy with unease. Ibrahim commanded a concubine to be sewn into an entire pelt, her arms and legs bound, her face peering through the stitched seams. She was left to writhe on the marble floor, unable to move with dignity, reduced to a twitching form of fur and flesh. The Sultan laughed, chasing her across the chamber, his voice echoing with manic joy as he shouted that she was the most loyal beast in his menagerie. Other nights he demanded more grotesque entertainments. Women were bound in silk cords, suspended in elaborate positions that blended spectacle with suffering. They were paraded before him like living sculptures. He walked among them, poking, prodding, adjusting their bodies as though perfecting the alignment of statues in a gallery. To Ibrahim, pain was not incidental. It was necessary. The tears, the gasps, the trembling limbs, they were the music of his theater. At times he demanded what even his closest servants could not record without shame. Foreign ambassadors later whispered of unnatural acts forced upon concubines, humiliations so profound that even in private correspondence they were veiled in vague terms. What is clear is that Ibrahim saw no distinction between woman and object, between body and toy. His partners were not human beings, but instruments of his appetite, props in a spectacle only he could enjoy. The scale of these rituals was staggering. Hundreds of women rotated through his chambers. Few could predict what role they would play. One night a favored concubine might be showered with jewels for pleasing him in a grotesque performance. The next night she might be drowned in a sack for failing to amuse him. Fear and desire mingled in every glance, every movement, every word spoken in his presence. This instability was deliberate. Ibrahim thrived on control. He delighted in keeping the harem uncertain, never knowing which action would bring reward and which would bring ruin. In this constant state of terror, he was the sole axis of power, the master of a world where every breath, every scream, every tear revolved around him. Even his mother, Topkapi Sultan, who had once controlled the empire through her son, grew horrified at the scale of his debauchery. She pleaded with him to restrain himself, warning that the harem was bleeding the empire dry, that his spectacles were turning allies into enemies, that his cruelty was staining the dynasty. But Ibrahim dismissed her. He was Sultan, the shadow of God on earth. To him, these rituals were not shameful. They were divine expressions of his will. What Ibrahim did not see, or refused to see, was how his private theater echoed beyond the palace walls. News of his gluttony, his fur-clad fantasies, his drowning sacks, spread through Istanbul like wildfire. Ordinary people, struggling under famine and taxes, heard stories of their sultan feasting while they starved, of their daughters being dragged into the harem to crawl like beasts, of their empire rotting from the inside, while its ruler played at cruelty. Discontent simmered in the streets. Soldiers grumbled in the barracks. Merchants cursed him in the markets. But inside his chambers, Ibrahim laughed louder than ever. The rituals grew longer, the demands more extravagant, the pain more deliberate. What had begun as indulgence had become obsession. The harem was no longer a place of women. It was a stage for Ibrahim's imagination, a stage where he was director, actor, and audience all at once. And like any addict, he required more each time, more women, more food, more humiliation, more spectacle. His appetite swelled like the bellies of the women he forced to feast, insatiable, grotesque, impossible to satisfy. The empire had given him everything, wealth, power, hundreds of lives bent to his command. But for Ibrahim, nothing was enough. Nothing could ever be enough. Behind the jeweled curtains of Topkapi Palace, Ibrahim's rituals grew more elaborate, more grotesque, more consuming. But outside those walls, the Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe and the pride of Islam, was beginning to fracture. Every ritual demanded resources. Every banquet of sweets required sugar imported at great cost. Every fur garment meant new taxes to purchase pelts from distant lands. Every drowning meant more concubines bought from merchants who grew rich, supplying the Sultan's insatiable appetites. To feed Ibrahim's excesses, the treasury was drained. Taxes rose across the empire. Farmers in Anatolia, already suffering from poor harvests, found themselves crushed beneath new levies. Merchants in Istanbul watched their profits vanish into palace coffers. Even the devout in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina whispered of shortages, as funds meant for religious endowments were redirected to Ibrahim's pleasures. It was not simply money that drained away, trade itself began to sour. Foreign ambassadors sent reports back to their courts, describing a ruler lost in madness. Letters from Venetian envoys mocked the Sultan's gluttony, his obsession with obese women, his drowning of hundreds of concubines. European traders, once eager to court Ottoman favor, grew wary of being tied to an empire ruled by such a figure. Deals faltered, ports grew quieter, ships sailed past Istanbul in search of more stable markets. The soldiers too felt the weight of neglect. The Janissaries, once the most disciplined fighting force in the world, were left unpaid while the Sultan poured coin into his harem spectacles. Their barracks rotted while his chambers overflowed with jewels and silks. Discipline crumbled, grumbling grew. Men trained for war found themselves idle, restless, angry at a ruler who demanded loyalty while offering nothing in return. Even the officers, hardened by campaigns in Hungary and Persia, began to whisper. They had fought under Murad IV, who had led them personally into battle, a sultan who shared their hardships and commanded their respect. Now they served Ibrahim, who had never seen war, who had spent his youth in a cage and his adulthood in orgies of humiliation. To them, it was not only an insult, it was a betrayal of everything the empire stood for. And while the army weakened, the world outside was shifting. European powers advanced with new weapons, new ships, new wealth from colonies. The Ottomans, once feared as the unstoppable empire at the gates of Vienna, were falling behind. But instead of preparing, Ibrahim was feasting. Instead of building armies, he was buying jewels for concubines. Instead of forging alliances, he was sewing women into furs and calling it art. His perversion was no longer a private shame. It reshaped politics itself. The palace was consumed with his demands. Viziers were forced to devote their energy not to governing provinces, but to finding more women, more furs, more food. Diplomats were commanded to negotiate not treaties, but shipments of exotic animals to fuel the sultan's fantasies. Ministers who objected were dismissed, exiled, or executed. The machinery of empire turned not toward conquest, but toward satisfying one man's compulsions. The people noticed. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, men whispered stories of their sultan's madness. In bazaars, merchants cursed his taxes. In mosques, preachers warned that God would not bless a ruler who drowned innocents in the Bosphorus. The aura of the Sultan as the shadow of God on earth dimmed. For centuries, the Ottoman throne had been cloaked in divine authority. Under Ibrahim, it was cloaked in ridicule, and ridicule is a dangerous poison for any ruler. Respect can inspire obedience. Fear can enforce silence. But ridicule corrodes both. Once a ruler becomes a joke, his throne becomes fragile. Ibrahim, drunk on power and lost in appetite, did not see it. He laughed as the empire bled. He demanded more women even as provinces rebelled. He wore his furs and staged his feasts while soldiers plotted in the barracks and viziers clenched their teeth in silence. What had begun as the private indulgence of a broken man had become a public crisis. The empire's finances cracked under the weight of his hunger. Its armies weakened. Its reputation abroad sank into scorn. And at the center of it all was Ibrahim, the mad sultan, demanding that the world bend to his desires. The Ottoman Empire had survived weak sultans before. It had endured civil wars, plagues, and invasions, but never before had it been forced to endure a ruler whose very madness became the empire's policy. Under Ibrahim, the line between private vice and public ruin vanished. His chamber was the empire, and the empire was his chamber. The question was no longer if this madness would break the empire, but when. For all his power, Ibrahim was never alone in his palace. Two women loomed larger than anyone else in his life, and for a time they were the only forces able to restrain him. His mother, Kafes Sultan, and his favorite consort, Turhan Sultan. Together, they formed a triangle of power, love, and betrayal that would decide not only Ibrahim's fate, but the fate of the Ottoman Empire itself. Kafes was no ordinary mother. She had been a concubine herself, a Greek girl brought into the harem as a teenager who rose to become Valide Sultan, the queen mother. Through decades of skill, cunning, and sheer endurance, she had ruled the empire during the reigns of her sons. She was a master of politics, beloved by the people, feared by the court. She knew the machinery of power better than any vizier. When Ibrahim emerged from the cage, it was Kafes who guided him. She stood beside him during his coronation, whispering advice, calming his paranoia, shielding him from ministers who might exploit his weakness. For a time, she was the true ruler of the empire, her son little more than a trembling figurehead. But Ibrahim's appetites grew too wild for even Kafes' control. She scolded him for his waste, warned him that drowning concubines and indulging in endless spectacles was not sustainable. He listened at first, then laughed. In his mind, he was no longer a boy under his mother's care. He was Sultan, chosen by God, absolute in authority, and absolute power does not listen to reason. Turhan Sultan entered this storm like a spark to dry timber. She was young, beautiful, and ambitious. Chosen as Ibrahim's favorite, she soon gave birth to a son, Prince Mehmed, an heir to the throne. With a child at stake, her influence grew. She argued with Qasim over how to manage Ibrahim, each woman vying for control of the harem and the empire beyond its walls. At first, Qasim welcomed her. A mother always seeks stability for her grandson, but the alliance soured quickly. Turhan was bold, unafraid to challenge the Queen Mother, unafraid to suggest that the empire needed younger leadership. In her, Qasim saw not a daughter-in-law but a rival. Ibrahim, caught between them, grew paranoid. He suspected plots in every glance, betrayal in every whisper. He accused concubines of conspiring with his enemies. He ordered the execution of harem servants for imagined treason. At his most unstable, he even considered killing his own son, his infant heir, convinced that the child was cursed and that Turhan had birthed him to overthrow the throne. Qasim fought desperately to stop him, and for once her influence prevailed. But the shadow of filicide hung over the palace, a warning of just how far Ibrahim's madness might go. The palace, once a place of opulence and order, became a battlefield of whispers and daggers. Qasim rallied ministers to her side, trying to restrain her son's excesses. Turhan secured allies among the janissaries, promising them rewards if her child were protected. Viziers walked on eggshells, terrified of choosing the wrong faction and paying with their lives. All the while, Ibrahim lashed out. Ministers who questioned him were strangled. Brothers and cousins suspected of disloyalty were locked away or executed. Even his own family was not safe. He ordered the death of one half-brother after dreaming that the man plotted against him. Dreams became judgments. Paranoia became policy. The tension inside Topkapi Palace was unbearable. Behind gilded doors, Qasim and Turhan plotted against each other, each believing she alone could save the empire. In the gardens, janissaries muttered of revolt. In the council chambers, viziers whispered of deposition. And in his chambers, Ibrahim staged new rituals, drowning the empire in spectacle while its foundations crumbled beneath him. The empire had survived many rulers, tyrants, weaklings, even children, but never had it endured a sultan whose paranoia threatened his own bloodline, whose madness turned the most powerful women in the palace into enemies, whose reign seemed less like governance and more like a prolonged unraveling. It was no longer a question of whether Ibrahim could be controlled. It was a question of who would control him, or who would end him first. Power without limits, even from a mother to her son, always ends in betrayal. If you value hearing the truth of history's monsters, subscribe to the History Scar. The palace walls had witnessed centuries of blood. Sultans had executed brothers to secure the throne, ministers to maintain loyalty, generals to silence dissent. But even in that long history, the reign of Ibrahim was different. His executions were not calculated acts of politics. They were eruptions of madness. The drowning of hundreds of concubines in the Bosphorus had already stained his reign beyond redemption. But Ibrahim's appetite for death did not stop there. It expanded, shifting from the harem to every corner of his empire. On one occasion, furious over rumors of disloyalty, Ibrahim ordered another sweep of the harem. Dozens of women were seized, stripped of their silks, and stuffed into heavy sacks. They were dragged through palace corridors as servants whispered prayers for their souls. Witnesses recorded the horror of the night, the line of women kicking and thrashing inside the sacks, their muffled cries echoing through the marble halls before they were hurled into the dark waters. The Bosphorus became a graveyard of innocence, its waves carrying whispers of madness through the city. But Ibrahim's cruelty was not confined to women. His paranoia spread to every living creature around him. He ordered prized horses slaughtered because their shadows startled him. He commanded the drowning of dogs brought to amuse him because their barking disturbed his sleep. Entire aviaries of exotic birds, gifts from distant lands, were strangled because their songs annoyed him during his meals. Even human lives were treated no differently. Ministers who questioned him were condemned without trial. A vizier who dared suggest reducing taxes to ease the people's suffering was accused of treason and executed before the council. Another, who hesitated before bowing, was dragged out by guards and strangled with a silken cord. Slaves were killed for trivial mistakes: a spilled goblet of wine, a garment not folded to his liking, a glance he deemed disrespectful. The palace chroniclers, usually cautious in describing their sovereigns, broke with tradition. They recorded Ibrahim as a wild beast in human form, a man ruled not by reason or strategy, but by impulse, paranoia, and rage. Foreign ambassadors echoed the same. A Venetian envoy wrote that the Sultan of the Ottomans was less a monarch than a tempest, a storm that spares nothing it touches. The executions took on a rhythm, a theater of fear. The silken bowstring, symbol of Ottoman justice, was no longer reserved for traitors and rivals. It became a tool of convenience, drawn at Ibrahim's slightest displeasure. The Janissaries, once loyal protectors of the dynasty, watched in horror as their comrades were dragged away for imagined offenses. Their loyalty wavered. Their fear curdled into resentment. In one notorious incident, Ibrahim declared that the Grand Vizier himself, the highest official of the empire, second only to the Sultan, had conspired against him. The Vizier was a man of decades of service, respected by soldiers and bureaucrats alike. But loyalty meant nothing before Ibrahim's madness. Without trial, without evidence, the Vizier was seized, strangled, and his body thrown into the sea. His death sent shockwaves through the empire. If the Grand Vizier was not safe, no one was. The executions were not always swift. Ibrahim sometimes prolonged them, demanding that victims be paraded through the palace before being killed, forcing others to watch as a warning. Ministers bowed lower. Servants trembled as they poured his wine. Even his own family lived in terror, never sure if his affection one day would turn to a death order the next. The empire itself began to crack under the weight of this terror. Soldiers grew restless, fearing their wages would never come while the treasury drained into spectacles and executions. Merchants cursed the instability. Foreign traders avoided Ottoman ports, and peasants whispered that the Sultan was cursed by God. And still the killings continued. Ibrahim believed himself untouchable, the embodiment of divine authority. But the truth was different. Each execution cut away at his support. Each drowning weakened his legitimacy. Each silken cord strangled not just a victim, but a fragment of the empire's loyalty to him. By the mid-1640s, the air in Istanbul was heavy with fear. The palace, once a symbol of order and majesty, had become a slaughterhouse. Ministers avoided the Sultan's gaze. Servants prayed to remain unseen. The people of the city crossed themselves when they heard the muffled cries of women being dragged to the Bosphorus at night. And yet, Ibrahim laughed. He roared with manic delight as lives ended at his command. To him, executions were not a burden of rulership. They were entertainment, proof of his power, fuel for his paranoia. He believed he was secure, but he was wrong. Each silken cord tightened not only around the throats of his victims, but around his own throne. The Janissaries were restless. The viziers whispered of rebellion. His mother and his consort watched with growing dread. Ibrahim could not see it, but the tide was turning. The breaking point had been reached. The empire would not endure much longer under a sultan who drowned his own harem, slaughtered his animals, and murdered his ministers on a whim. Suspense hung over the palace like a drawn bowstring. The question was no longer if Ibrahim would fall, but how. By the late 1640s, the empire had endured nearly a decade of Ibrahim's excesses. The treasury was empty, the Janissaries restless, the people starving. Ministers and viziers lived in constant fear of strangulation. The once great Ottoman court had become a house of terror, and in that house whispers began to gather. The first to break the silence were the viziers. They had watched colleagues executed for the slightest hesitation, seen grand viziers cast into the sea without trial. They knew their turn would come sooner or later. Around council tables and in private gardens, they began to speak openly of what had once been unthinkable, the deposition of the Sultan. The Janissaries needed little persuasion. These elite soldiers had once marched with pride under sultans who led them to victory. Now they were forced to collect taxes to fund their masters' perversions. They had gone unpaid for months at a time, while Ibrahim poured gold into silks, furs, and women. Their loyalty, once ironclad, had corroded into bitterness. The ulama, the religious scholars of the empire, added their voices. They had tolerated cruelty before, even tyranny, but Ibrahim's drowning of concubines, his obsession with gluttony, his waste of the empire's wealth, these could not be squared with divine law. To many imams, he was no longer the shadow of God on earth. He was a madman, unworthy of the caliphate. At the center of this conspiracy stood one figure who knew Ibrahim better than anyone, his mother, Perverted Sultan. For years she had defended him, restrained him, guided him. But she saw the empire collapsing. She had watched her son's paranoia grow until he threatened even his own heir. And Kosem knew the Ottoman dynasty could not survive much longer under Ibrahim. It was she who gave the final nod. The coup unfolded with terrifying speed. On the morning of August 8, 1648, Janissaries stormed the palace. Ministers and guards loyal to the court stepped aside. Ibrahim was caught unprepared. He had spent the night in one of his grotesque rituals and awoke to the sound of boots thundering across the marble floors. He demanded to know what was happening, but no answer came. His guards deserted him. His viziers stood silent. Even his beloved concubines shrank into the corners of their chambers. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, ruler of millions, found himself suddenly alone. When the soldiers entered his chamber, Ibrahim's madness gave way to panic. He screamed that it was all a mistake, that God had chosen him, that the empire would fall without him. He clutched at his robes, at the cushions, at anything to anchor himself against the storm. But there was no anchor. His mother's orders had already sealed his fate. Dragged from his chambers, Ibrahim was taken to a small, dark room in the palace. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his childhood in the cage, fearing assassination. Now, at the end of his reign, he found himself once again in confinement, waiting for death. Witnesses describe him pacing like a trapped animal, weeping, bargaining, raging. He begged his mother for mercy, promising to change, promising to abandon his excesses. But Kosem never came. She had withdrawn, leaving her son to the fate she had authorized. Finally, the stranglers entered. 2 men carrying the silken cord, the traditional instrument of Ottoman execution. Ibrahim saw them and collapsed in terror. He clutched at the floor, screamed for help, promised loyalty to anyone who would listen. His voice echoed down the corridors. "Do not kill me, I am your sultan, I am your ruler." But no one came. The Janissaries stood silent. The viziers watched coldly. His mother turned her face away. The stranglers advanced. Ibrahim's screams rose higher, breaking into sobs. He clawed at the walls, his fingernails tearing as he tried to escape. He fought like a man possessed, kicking, thrashing, crying out for God's mercy. But mercy had long since abandoned him. The cord was thrown around his neck. He struggled, tearing at it with frantic hands. His body writhed on the floor, his face purple with strain. For a moment, it seemed he might break free, but the stranglers pulled tighter, their arms locked, their faces impassive. Slowly, Ibrahim's thrashing weakened. His screams turned to gasps, his gasps to silence. And then, it was over. Sultan Ibrahim I, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad, lay lifeless on the cold stone floor. He was 33 years old. His reign had lasted just 8 years. His death was not mourned. It was a release. Outside the palace, the people of Istanbul rejoiced. The Janissaries cheered. Merchants gave thanks. Imams proclaimed that justice had been done. For the first time in years, the empire breathed. But the scars remained. The treasury was empty, the army restless, the harem decimated, the dynasty shaken. Ibrahim's madness had nearly drowned the empire. His death saved it, temporarily. Imagine living under such madness, where one man's obsession drowned empires. If you believe it must be remembered, like and share this story. The death of Ibrahim the Mad brought relief to an empire on the brink, but it also left a question that echoes through the centuries. What exactly was he? Was he a monster born of madness, or a broken child shaped by trauma into something unrecognizable? Historians have wrestled with this question. Ottoman chroniclers, writing in the decades after his death, leaned toward condemnation. They called him deluded, a wild beast in human form, and a danger to the throne and to God's order. For them it was safer, politically and morally, to label him mad and close the book. Madness could be explained away. Madness absolved the dynasty. But others looked deeper. They pointed to the cage, the Kafes system, as the seed of his ruin. For 20 years, Ibrahim lived in confinement, denied education, denied companionship, denied purpose. He emerged into power not as a trained ruler, but as a hollow vessel filled with paranoia and hunger. Could any man survive such isolation with his humanity intact? Some modern scholars argue that his perversion was not merely sickness, but the inevitable result of a system that caged boys and then expected them to rule the world. The empire itself survived his fall. His young son Mehmed Thor took the throne under the guidance of Perverted Sultan and later Turhan Sultan. Under them, the Ottomans clawed their way back from the chaos, restoring order to the court, stabilizing the treasury, reining in the janissaries. The state lived on, but the scars remained. The treasury, once overflowing with tribute, had been gutted by Ibrahim's feasts and indulgences. The army, once feared from Vienna to Baghdad, had tasted neglect and rebellion. The harem, once a place of dynastic continuity, had been turned into a stage of humiliation and massacre. These wounds did not vanish with Ibrahim's death. They lingered, shaping the politics of the court for decades, and in the memory of the people, Ibrahim was not just another weak ruler, he was a warning. Markets, mosques, and coffee houses carried stories of his gluttony, his drownings, his obsession with furs. Mothers whispered his name as a curse, a reminder of what unchecked power could do. The empire recovered in form, but the shadow of Ibrahim's reign stretched long across its history. To understand his place in the wider story of power, we must look beyond the Ottoman walls. History offers many rulers who collapsed into perversion once they believed themselves untouchable. Nero of Rome, who fiddled while his city burned, who indulged in theater and cruelty with equal delight. Caligula, who made his horse a consul and staged orgies in his palace, reveling in humiliation as if it were policy. Tiberius, who retreated to the island of Capri with pools filled with children trained to satisfy his every whim. Ibrahim belongs to this lineage of rulers, undone not by invasion, but by appetite. Yet his story carries a uniquely Ottoman dimension. The Roman emperors had been raised in courts and camps, trained in politics before their fall into decadence. Ibrahim had no such preparation. The cage shaped him in ways that Nero and Caligula never knew. The isolation, the paranoia, the sudden flood of power after decades of nothing. This was the crucible that made him. And there was the harem. For centuries, Western writers imagined it as a paradise of pleasure, but under Ibrahim, it became a mirror of his broken mind. Women were not companions, but animals, costumes, props in grotesque rituals. The harem's politics, its rivalries between concubines, its battles between Kusum and Turhan, turned Ibrahim's chamber into a battlefield as deadly as any front in Europe or Asia. In this, his reign was not just a story of madness, but of how the Ottoman system itself could turn inward and devour its own. What then is his legacy? To some, he is simply Ibrahim the Mad, a cautionary tale of indulgence. To others, he is the proof that no empire, however vast, can survive when its throne is filled by a man consumed by paranoia and lust. His reign demonstrates that the greatest threat to a civilization often comes not from armies at the gates, but from the rot within its palaces. And so, centuries later, his story endures. His name still carries the weight of scandal. His memory still stirs unease. The Ottomans tried to erase him, to bury his madness beneath the victories of later rulers. But history remembers. The Bosphorus remembers. The silence of his drowned concubines remembers. Because Ibrahim's reign was not simply about one man's perversion, it was about the cost of absolute power, the fragility of institutions, the way trauma and indulgence can fuse into catastrophe. In that sense, his story is not just Ottoman history, it is human history. Empires fall not from outside enemies, but from rot within. If you don't subscribe to the History Scar today, then explain why you're okay with letting these lessons fade into silence. Picture it again. The torchlight flickering across the palace chambers. Women covered in oil crawling on all fours in animal skins, their humanity stripped away for the amusement of one man. The sacks being sewn shut, women thrashing inside, their muffled screams carried out to the Bosphorus, where hundreds sank into the black waters. The furs, the feasts, the spectacles of humiliation that turned the most powerful empire in the world into a theater of madness. This was the reign of Ibrahim I, a man remembered as Ibrahim the Mad. But to call him only mad is to miss the deeper truth. He was not simply a monster who appeared out of nowhere. He was the product of trauma, the child who grew up in silence, locked away in the cage. He was the reflection of a system that allowed absolute power without accountability. He was the warning of what happens when lust, paranoia, and authority mix unchecked. History remembers him with disgust but also with unease. Because the story of Ibrahim is not unique. Every age has its tyrants who confuse appetite with power, cruelty with strength, spectacle with governance. Rome had its Caligula, who made his empire into a circus of blood and ridicule. Germany and Russia in the 20th century had their dictators who consumed nations in their paranoia. Even today, whispers of power abused behind closed doors remind us that Ibrahim's shadow has never truly disappeared. The women drowned in the Bosphorus have no graves. Their names are forgotten, their bodies long dissolved into the currents of the strait, but their absence speaks louder than any inscription. It warns us that when rulers see people as objects, when leaders indulge in their appetites without restraint, entire civilizations bend and break around their madness. The lesson of Ibrahim is not confined to Ottoman history. It belongs to all of us. Absolute power without accountability will always create monsters, and those monsters will not be born. They will be made, shaped by trauma, fueled by indulgence, and protected by the silence of those too afraid to resist. When we remember Ibrahim's oil-soaked spectacles and his drowning sacks, we should not look at them as distant horrors from another age. We should see them as echoes of every time leaders have turned institutions into stages for their desires. Echoes of every time societies looked away while the powerful fed on the powerless. Echoes of every time silence enabled cruelty. He died strangled in a palace room, crying out that he was sultan, that he was chosen by God, that he could not be touched. But he was touched. His reign ended. His body was buried. Yet his madness lives on in every place where power is unchecked. That is why his story matters. That is why we cannot let it be forgotten. Don't let this story vanish into silence like Ibrahim tried to vanish his victims. Subscribe to the History Scar, and if you won't, the least you can do is tell us why in the comments below, because silence only protects the next monster. So remember Ibrahim the Mad. Remember the drowned women, the oil, the furs, the feasts that consumed an empire. Share this story so others cannot look away. Comment so the silence does not return. And most of all, subscribe to the History Scar, because history's darkest scars are warnings, and if we ignore them, we will carve them again into the flesh of the future. He died, but his madness still lives where